Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday the 15th of August. My name's Maggie Lennon. My name's still Maggie Lennon, and we'll start the programme with the up-to-date coronavirus statistics. As of 2 o'clock on Saturday, 1,383 new confirmed cases of COVID-19 were recorded. There were 5 new reported deaths of people who had tested positive. 4,050,011 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,431,062 have received their second dose. 336 people were in hospital with recently confirmed COVID-19, 39 of whom were in intensive care. Since the start of the pandemic, a total of 362,364 people in Scotland have tested positive for COVID, and sadly, 8,032 patients who did test positive have died. I'm joined today by Abdul Bostani, Chair of the Scottish Unity League and Director of Glasgow Afghan United, and Greg McCarra, Chief Executive of the Scottish Independence Foundation and Convener of the Trade Union Group of the SNP. Good morning to you both, gentlemen.
Morning.
Or good afternoon, I should say. We're going to start the programme dealing with the breaking news from Afghanistan. Since just before coming on air, we've learned that the Taliban have now entered Kabul, having surrounded it this morning, and we understand that they are now in the process of negotiating a peaceful transition of power to them. So, Abdul, it now looks like this is it, that the Taliban now have complete control of Afghanistan. What are your community in Glasgow in Scotland? What are Afghans in Scotland feeling about this? How worried are they for their families back home in Afghanistan?
Hello, Maggie. Thank you very much for inviting me here. Yes, it is very concerning the way the situation have escalated in the past few days. None of us were thinking like this will happen so quick in this way, and we were expecting a kind of resistance against this group, but nothing like that has happened. As you all see, lots of cities have fallen in the hand of Taliban, and they're entering doors of Kabul right now. I have to say this is not finished yet, but there is rumors of the new interim government for the 6 months going to happen, and there will be a transition, not to the Taliban though, it is going to be a transition to impartial parties who will govern for 6 months, where conflicts of Afghanistan, people who are part of this conflict will enter a new negotiating table, a new deal to maybe within the period of 6 months, they will negotiate something which should happen peacefully. I think the whole world is supporting something to happen peacefully, and people should talk, should sit into the table, say no to fighting. And in the past 40 years, fighting never resolved any issues, and moving on forward, the fighting will not resolve anything at all. And something has to happen peacefully, something has to happen through talk.
Well, obviously that would be the best outcome from a bad situation. But given that the Taliban now control all the major cities in Taliban and all, I think, of the provinces, they're in a position of power and have the upper hand. So what's in it for them to sit down and talk rather than just take back the country as they had control 20 years ago before the American-led invasion?
I think one of the problem for this was like we were having government in the past 20 years, like none of us voted for. Like these people came not through a democratic process. They were imposed by America to us. These people had no popularity amongst Afghans. And of course, if there is a resistance, people will think first like, who are we fighting for? For these leaders who were introduced by the United States and the rest of the world who were so corrupt, or on the other hand, we have the Taliban who are so cruel. So people of Afghanistan are so confused now, but it doesn't mean like the resistance will not form. If the negotiation fails, there is no peace talk. Like if the Taliban is not coming through peace, then there is a highly likely the resistance will take place in this country, and nobody, and the history shows that nobody can control Afghanistan through force, and that will not happen again this time.
Well, that is true. The history of Afghanistan makes fascinating reading if you think from colonial times in the UK right through to the Russians, and more recently, Afghan is a country that is difficult to control. So, are you saying that one of the reasons possibly that the Taliban have met such little resistance, because it does appear that tribal leaders and local governors have surrendered without resistance, and it appears that the armed forces have not resisted. Are you saying that's because the people of Afghanistan were unhappy with what they were left with once the Americans had gone, and that that's one of the reasons the Taliban have been able to take advantage of that? And so do you really seriously think that there will be an opportunity for democratic elections and for a different outcome happening than we're imagining is going to happen? Because obviously most Western reporters are suggesting that the Taliban will just take power and the country will go back to the position it was before 2001. So are you saying it's the corruption of the other government, the fact that they were imposed upon the Afghan people, that has contributed to the current situation? Just so I can understand.
Yes, Maggie, definitely. We had leaders imposed by American to us, like had no popularity amongst Afghans. We did had elections, but those election was the most like I would say one of those elections like not properly done, and there were a lot of issues around that election. So the people who won the election, they were not giving the power. People who had no popularity not win any election. We have a president like have less than 1 million vote in a country of over 40 million population. This is a disaster, and that's why we have those issues today. Like people of Afghanistan have thinking like who or should we fight for? And plus, these corrupt leaders have brought people to us to govern us. Like they would not came by the will of people. We had people running a brigade, running a city, running the entire region who has no popularity. Nobody is behind them. How could you fight these like war against the Taliban here? So it's extremely difficult. And this is exactly what is happening right now. Like nobody is willing to defend this government, but at the same time, it doesn't mean people are happy with the Taliban. I mean, majority of people do not like Taliban the way they are governing, the way they're trying to govern the country. We want a democratic country. We want a democratic society where we vote for our like people who wants to run our administration. We want to have governor like to come through elected governor through an election, and we want a president who should come through a real election and win it in a proper way. And if we were like 20 years ago, we had a golden situation or like golden opportunity for Afghanistan. But all of them, like the way America played the card wrongly, all of them is gone. Almost everything is gone.
Greg, I want us to think then about that last 20 years. Something like 64 billion, if not more, has been spent by the United States and the Allies in trying to prepare Afghanistan for a time when they would withdraw. And that's been on the cards for at least the last 6 or 7 years. British forces have been involved, excuse me, for 20 years trying to build the military and the armed forces. Given how quickly the armed forces have capitulated, do you think then, is that just basically evidence that this last 20 years has been pointless and worthless because we seem to be back in the position we were in 2001? Or is there anything that the Allied forces can take from their time in Afghanistan, given what Abdul is saying about the hopes for a different outcome this time? What do you feel about that?
So much to say in this. By the way, I'm not going to pretend to have a fraction of the knowledge of the situation there and the history of Afghanistan compared with Abdul. But it's something that I've had, I've kept an eye on most of my life and aware of some of the history of it. At the moment, it's the Americans who are retreating from their previous, as you mentioned, Maggie. Well, I remember the Russian invasion in Christmas 1979. But before that, Rudyard Kipling referred to what was going on in Afghanistan as the Great Game. And that's all it was. It was a game of British imperialism. But before that, 2,000 years ago, it was Alexander the Great that invaded, and that's where he kind of ran up against a brick wall, and eventually that was the end of his exploits. It's just a playground for people who have who wishes to expand their control. And really, the lesson that maybe should be learned from it is, if you take all of the money that has been spent on devastating the country and just gave back a small fraction of that just to help in the reconstruction of the country, no strings attached, not you get funding if you do something politically that we insist on, no strings, just help in the reconstruction for those who have actually been applying in the destruction, then that might help a little bit. Every country has a right to self-determination. If Afghanistan chooses democratically to have one form of government, that is their right. Other countries saying you can have any kind of government you want as long as it's our type of government, that's wrong. And that's the basis of so many of the problems. So but lessons to be learned from that. Maybe we should just get over this wee kind of colonialist or imperialist type interventions. They're rather a few centuries out of date, and they always come back and bite, and they always end in failure. Maybe we could learn to do something slightly more positive now.
Abdul, one of the reasons the Americans went into Afghanistan in the first place was because they were sheltering Al-Qaeda following the attacks on the World Trade Center on 9/11. And there has now been a suggestion that if the Taliban, even if they don't come back into power fully, but given that they now control huge areas of the country, the traditional south and western regions that they've always controlled, but increasingly in the north, are you concerned that extremist terrorism might find another home in Afghanistan, making it again a target for international interventions, or causing the people of Afghanistan more problems?
I'm very concerned about that. This is a very fact and clear. Like Taliban has connection with lots of other terrorist groups who are operating in Pakistan as well, right? And in the past, we have already seen like Taliban have opened the door to them. Those people were coming into Afghanistan, operating from Afghanistan, creating tensions and instability around the world. And as a result, we had 9/11, we had London bombing, we had Spain, Madrid bombing, and we had hundreds of like that. And the world needs to be very careful here. This is not a joke. These things will come back again because those borders of Afghanistan are right open to all those terrorist groups. They will come and based in Afghanistan. They will use own for their benefit. Sorry, my friend. And which they have done it in the past, and I have no doubt about it. That will happen. Leaving Afghanistan in the hand of Taliban, we are saying to the rest of the world, like, be very careful because none of us will be secure, none of us will be safe. Everything is possible, anything could happen because Afghanistan once again will be a home for terrorism, a home for those groups who are like corrupt groups from around the world will be homed in Afghanistan, and that will be their headquarters once again, unfortunately.
Okay, so you talked about this hoped for 6-month transition period when a new form of government, which is duly elected and is the government the people want. And Greg's point is a strong one. If whatever the government is that is chosen, if it's democratically elected and that's the one the Afghan people want, then that is the right government for Afghanistan. But given that you obviously believe that the American intervention in the first place has partly caused this problem, what do you think Or is there a role for external players in this 6 month transition? What do you want to see other countries doing to help make this pass in a peaceful manner? Or do we not have a role? Do we just need to back away from this? Given that you've just said the opening the door to international terrorism is a real threat, and obviously countries are going to be worried about that. So what do you want America and its allies to do, if anything, in the next 6 months?
I think the whole world, there is still time. We still have time. The whole world needs to be very careful. We need to have a social justice in place. We need to hope for or maybe support in Afghanistan, where we have a government like elected by the people of Afghanistan. That should be guaranteed. Our rights should not be taken away from us. We should have that right. The way it looks to me, like Taliban are always opposed that idea of like people should be elected or a government should be elected by the people of Afghanistan. They are kind of imposing like whatever they want, they will do whatever way they want to govern the country. That shouldn't be allowed. We should support the people of Afghanistan. We should honor the thought of the people of Afghanistan on their own future. And it is very clear what the people of Afghanistan wants. We want a government which is independent, which is not rely to the other allies. Or I never want America to be there or any other country. At the same time, as an ordinary Afghan, we want a government which comes through us. We elect that government and they come to govern us. It shouldn't be imposed by anyone, and it shouldn't be imposed by a terrorist group to us. Like, here you go, this is the type of government you want. And I want a government where every Afghan citizen, every person who are in Afghanistan should have a say to them, like should have an opportunity to choose their one. Right now, the way it is looking, it is like I could see like it is a kind of disaster. The international community must support us in here to make sure those values and measures are in place, where we have a government which is coming by the will of the people of Afghanistan. And that is very important, very crucial. In the past 20 years, international community tried to do, although they made lots of mistakes. As a result of those mistakes, we're in this type of situation right now. We're in the middle of nowhere, but they should not make that mistake once again here. They need to be very careful and make a decision where they should support the social justice should not be sacrificed, and the voting of the people choosing their own future should not be sacrificed here for the sake of talk. No matter Taliban in the past, Taliban had 95% or 90% of geographical area. Geographical area of a country is not important. It is important, like you need to have their heart and minds. Taliban don't have that hearts and minds of the people of Afghanistan. They only have the geographical area, like they took some of them by war, some of them unfortunately happened as a result of negligence of those corrupt administration. But the heart and mind of people of Afghanistan are not in the hand of Taliban. And the people of Afghanistan want a type of government where they should have a rule to elect them, and a type of government where everybody's right is in place, women's right, ethnic minorities' right, every citizen rights are guaranteed there, and opportunities should be shared equally to every citizen of Afghanistan. This is what we want. We don't want a type of government which should impose by others or should be imposed by a particular group or a terrorist group.
Abdul, that's a very hopeful message, and it's obviously the outcome that people want. But in the meantime, people are concerned about reprisals. I mean, America and Britain are pulling out their people, and scenes reminiscent of the end of the Vietnamese War. There's concerns about people who've worked for British and American companies being subject of reprisals. But you mentioned women's rights, and clearly that's one of the most obvious things that people are focusing on. Already we are seeing that across the country women are being forced back into wearing burqas. In the last 20 years, there's been a real rise of women in positions of power in Afghanistan, women judges, women teachers, women students, women journalists, girls back at school. And there's real concern that there's going to be a massive pullback on that, and that the rights of women, as well as ethnic minorities within Afghanistan, are going to suffer. Is that something that you're worried about in the short term, even while we try to get to this new hopeful vision for your country?
Yes, there are lots of things we are worried about. As you mentioned, one thing is the most important is the role of women in our society. Women make over 50% of our society, and they're the great social human asset of our country, and that should be used properly. And saying to women, you're not allowed to work, you're not allowed to go to your education, you're not allowed to go to school, you're not allowed to go to do anything at all, that means we are dismantling 50% of the society. And this is not right. This is not even religious at all. And this is so concerning like that. This should not be negotiated at all. Our women rights, not at all, should not be negotiated whatsoever. And this is one of the things that the international community, when they're sitting at the table talk with the Taliban, should be very careful with this one. Like in the past 20 years, one of the little achievement we had, with lots of support by the international community of billions of dollars were invested over there. As you just mentioned, we have some women in some rules, although there were lots of abuse taking place, lots of things should not happen, that happened to a lot of women over there. But we had some sort of achievements, and we should continue to support that, and we should not negotiate that at all. It's very painful for me to see lots of women are showing their concern, trying to escape the country, trying to live and hide, living in neighboring country, and that should not happen at all whatsoever. And equally to our younger generation can't see their future in Afghanistan right now. They see a future full of difficulties, full of trauma, and their life in danger. As a result, they're fleeing our country. That should not be the case. These young generation are assets of Afghanistan again, and that should be supported. They should have a proper, happy future in Afghanistan. On these negotiations, which is taking place, and these measures like must be mentioned over there, and that should not be negotiated at all. I am very concerned about in the past few months, people have went in Doha, and Zalmay Khalilzad from USA was doing a lot of talk, coming and sitting on the table, and he didn't do his job properly. He didn't do. He was the one allowing this situation to happen in Afghanistan from day one. I mean, now the whole Afghan community, either in Afghanistan, out of Afghanistan, believe this. Zalmay Khalilzad was the worst person ever to be part of this process.
Well, it almost doesn't matter in some respects why it's happened or who's to blame. The result is the human tragedy, as you say, of the human resource of Afghanistan. Thousands of civilians dead, thousands of civilians already in exile with the prospect of more being killed if a civil war erupts, and thousands more seeking exile. We've no idea, of course, whether the United Kingdom will step up and agree to take refugees who are fleeing Afghanistan. We certainly have an obligation, but given that the recent statements by the Home Secretary on what she thinks about refugees, I think it's unlikely. But the world is holding its breath to see what happens. I hope it has the positive and socially just outcome that you are praying for, Abdul. I really do. I have my doubts, I have to say, but we will wait and see. We have to move on, I'm afraid, although not really too far. We're still sticking with issues around women. We have reported on this programme for several months now on the growing tide of toxic masculinity and toxic misogyny, which seems to get into every aspect of life in the UK, and it had perhaps its most visual and visceral outpouring this week with the atrocious murders in Plymouth by a self-confessed misogynist, a man who blamed his mother for his own failings as a man. In that, he's not alone. There's a growing movement of this. Greg, given that this man and the people who are now this morning claiming he's a saint, thousands of them apparently, have this visceral hatred of women, are the police right to say that this was not a terrorist attack? what makes a terrorist? What makes a domestic terrorist? Someone or a group of people who have ultimate hatred for a half of society surely have to be considered as a risk, and there should be action taken, don't you think? Oh, can't hear you, Greg, sorry. Oh, we seem to have...
Absolutely, Maggie. And in those kind of circumstances, an attack on one person is an attack on us all, because it kind of shakes the foundations of our society. When I was a youngster, I remember I heard all around me casual racism and casual misogyny. It was the way of the world, but we've learned from that. Hopefully, most of us in the society, and we can't tolerate it. I'm glad to say that although that might have been the norm to treat women as inferior people in the times of my grandparents, the case of my kids, they would look at that and just with disbelief, because their culture is to utterly reject those kind of attitudes. Terrorism, I'm not too worried about the label of it, because there's a danger of categorising and saying, oh, it's this class of crime, therefore it will be dealt with in this way. It's much more fundamental than that. We can't just kind of throw a switch and say, right, that's how we handle it. The misogynism, what is left of misogynism is very large, largely suppressed because people know that they shouldn't speak, act or write in a misogynist way because they'll be under attack, and yet it's still buried inside them, and then it'll still come out when they have the opportunity. And as you mentioned earlier on, this person being referred to as a saint, sometimes there's a valve opens, there's an opportunity for people to have outpourings of their hatred. Because they feel they have safety in numbers, at least for a brief period of time, and I suspect that's what we're seeing there. The way that they treat this disease is to treat it at the source and treat it as a disease, and it's the treatment for that is just to push a bit harder with our education of the upcoming generations. But for those who insist on still preaching this hatred against women, there have to be more serious consequences for it again. And if that's the will of society, then that's what we want to do, and we can strengthen our laws to treat that more like the hate crime that the other acts are treated as. So it's a basic flaw in society. We're just seeing these are the manifestations that we're seeing of it, and unless we address that basic flaw, then we're always going to get attitudes like that popping up, and then large crowds of people piling in and agreeing with it, and there's a burst of this kind of bigotry coming out.
I think it's important to realise, though, that this isn't something that is happening in isolation in the UK or elsewhere. This is part of a wider kind of alternative right movement where you're trying not just to say that women are inferior, but that women are the enemy. And given that women make up 52% of society across the world, I guess it would be fair to say society is not prepared to put up with that. And the fact that it may be repressed, or people are not as willing to voice these feelings as they once were because of a backlash, doesn't mean these feelings have gone away. But I simply cannot understand where we are in society that it appears there is a movement across the alternative right that is trying to make women into second-class citizens. It's very similar to what we're seeing in other parts of the world. We've just been talking about the potential attack from the Taliban on women's rights in Afghanistan, and we know that it exists in other Islamic countries. I simply as a woman, cannot understand where this is coming from. And it really feels that as a woman, we just don't have that international protection. We just are all at risk of this. And women who are speaking out on this latest issue in Plymouth are coming under real risk and attack and threat on social media. And social media is clearly part of it, Greg. Isn't it time we did something about closing down those channels in social media? And the dark web as well is obviously where a lot of it is going on that is unreported and unseen.
Yeah, but let's not kid ourselves that social media exists there as a wonderful modern mechanism for free communication between all people. No, it's there as a business. It's there to make money, and therefore the shutting down of aspects of social media harms the pockets of those who own it. And you're talking about a small group of people in here. So we're up against quite dark forces when we try to take on the owners of social media, because they have the money, they have the funds which will help them to persuade politicians to back them. Okay, I'll use careful terms in here. So we've got to be aware of that. And yet we've got to do it. I have a view in these kind of things that it's easy for us to sit in our armchairs and say, oh, that's terrible, it's time somebody did something about it. That's actually my most hated expression, and I never use it personally, because it's not up for anybody else to do something about a bad thing. It's up to us individually. So really, I go back to the education part in here, and persuasion. People have to get into the mindset that when they see misogyny, if they see somebody talking, acting in a misogynist way, they don't sit back, go tut, and then chat about it later on. They deal with it face on at the point where it occurs. And that's the only way to address it. If somebody is behaving in that kind of manner in a group, then in that group there has to be at least one person outspoken and saying, sorry, I don't accept that.
Yeah,
and at that point, the rest might say, well, we agree, we don't accept it.
I think that's right. It's call it out wherever it's seen. If you're a man and your mates down the pub are coming out with this nonsense, call it out. If you have sons, make sure you're educating them not to think of women in that way. We're moving on now to climate change. This week, the long-awaited UN IPCC report was published on climate change, just 3 months before COP26 happens in Glasgow. The report is quite clear. It has given climate change deniers nowhere to hide. Greenhouse gases are driving the extreme weather, therefore it is a result of humans. There are unprecedented levels and speed of global warming. And the target of which was agreed in Paris in 2015 of trying to make sure global temperatures don't increase by more than 1.5% from pre-industrial times is already at 1.1%. And so that target is at risk. And the message has been clear. We still have time, not very much, but some time to turn our backs on this. Now, global warming and climate change is affecting all over the world. Abdul, we were laughing before we came on air about your wonderful watermelons that you're growing in your greenhouse in Glasgow, and we were saying well done. But it isn't funny, is it, the fact that people are able to grow crops and things in different parts of the world that they never would do before? How worried are you about the impact of climate change in the world, and how concerned are you that ordinary people on whom the responsibility will be put to try and help us all become net zero, how worried are you are ordinary people don't have the resources or are not getting the support of government to be able to do what's needed of them?
I think, first of all, yes, the watermelon, as I was calling it the first watermelon in Scotland. So we are thankful we have got a community allotment in Glasgow where we grow vegetables and fruits. And we have introduced some vegetables from Afghanistan. They did work really well. Some of them could be growing outside in the Scottish climate, and some of them is greenhouse like watermelon and melon of Afghanistan. Yes, we are very worried about climate change. We have to do a lot in terms of climate. Yes, community needs lots of support, like a consultation, how to behave. We need to change our behavior. As soon as we manage to shift our behavior towards zero net, and that would be easy to move forward. If we are not properly educated, if we don't know how to behave, then no matter how we do things, it will not work. I will give you a very small example. Like, we have lots of different kind of bins outside of our door. If we do our work properly, throw things in a proper bin, that's we have done our duty as a citizen properly. Now it's great. We have done a few consultation within our community, a few workshops actually within our community for children, where we have teach them how to be a responsible citizen, how to do your own duties. And you won't believe the way the children have their own things, how they want to behave, how they want to save the planet. And it is great. And we need to continuously educate them, teach them how to be as responsible citizen, how to do their job properly. And it's not just in the hand of the government, it is a responsibility of every one of us to play our role. And once we do that, we are successful.
Greg, Abdul makes a good point there. We know that the younger generation really are aware of this. It's kind of their big political issue in the way that ours in the past was something else. And all that's great. It's not enough, is it, for the next generation to be concerned about this? Really, the responsibility lies with government. There were a number of representatives of some of the communities in Scotland who are suffering the greatest social deprivation just a week or two ago, saying, if you want us to become net zero, if you want to help us make our contribution, we need lots of support. And a report has just come out in the last 24 hours, actually, from a leading scientist, saying that Westminster are not serious in making any of this happen because they're about to follow another austerity agenda as we come out of the pandemic. We know that they're already turning away from initiatives which would help poorer communities turn away from gas to heat their homes, turn away from initiatives that would help insulation in poorly insulated homes. And that's a big issue in Scotland, where a lot of social housing is very poorly insulated. They're turning away from improved infrastructure. They're turning away from foreign aid to poorer countries, which they could use in order to make themselves net zero. So really, is all of this just, puff and wind from Westminster, where they're not really prepared to put their money where their mouth is? And if that's the case, although Scotland's leading in renewables, what are we going to be able to do to help people in Scotland do their bit? Oh, can't hear you, Greg, sorry.
Again, keep on muting deliberately. You'll not be surprised to hear me say that there's much that we can do with powers that we have just now, but considerably more that we will be able to do when Scotland has the full powers of a normal independent country. We have, for example, we produce considerably more electricity from renewable sources than we did before. It's growing massively. We're self-sufficient in that respect. We export in that respect. It's difficult to export when we get charged for producing renewable electricity and putting it into the national grid. And yet in London they get subsidised when they do that there. So there are aspects of UK policy which are absolutely back to front and need to be reversed. I think most of our society is a little bit greedy and just short-termist. We look to the future and say, oh, it's going to be great. Our kids and our grandkids will get this all sorted because they've got wonderful attitudes. And meanwhile, we do all our gas guzzling. We use considerably more energy than we need. And we are the drivers, our generation, the people on this programme and our friends are the ones who are actually driving the problem here. So politicians themselves are not going to solve this normally, because the short-termism of a politician is normally the next election and how to get re-elected, and ideally from their viewpoint for them to get into power. What they do is not really so relevant. It's just power. So we have to get people to threaten the politicians to say, well, sorry, we don't like your agenda. We insist on another agenda, and not one that leaves it to our grandkids to solve problems, but which deals with the imminent, urgent emergency right now. And if we don't deal with it, then there are consequences for you, the politician.
So
how you do that, tricky.
So, I was going to say, where do you stand then on the Campbell oil field, the new oil field that's just been discovered off Shetland? Nicola Sturgeon has just said this week she's encouraging the UK government, who hold the licences for further exploration, to put a moratorium on that. Now, for years and years and years, even people who don't know very much about Scottish independence knew it's Scotland's oil, the big phrase from the 70s. Oil in Scotland and the economy have been inextricably linked for a long time. Although there's an admission we need to move away from that with the just transition, etc., etc. This is going to appear as a big U-turn for the SNP. So has Nicola got any choice, given that COP26 is coming down the road, given that SNP want to be greener than Westminster, given there might be a power sharing agreement with the Greens? Has she got any choice, or is she doing this through gritted teeth?
It was funny, Maggie, that you used the expression there, that Scotland's oil. That was the big campaign used in the 1970s when we saw the first rise of the SNP, and the concept of Scottish independence was beginning then to become credible. And that that term, "It's Scotland's oil," there was an attempted hijack of it in the last few days from social media output from the Conservatives, the Scottish Conservatives, and they're trying to turn it around and say, this is oil from Scotland's waters, and we must take it out of the seabed. Otherwise, it's going to be damaging to Scotland. It's hypocrisy. It's utter guff, and I hope everybody had a good laugh at it. Most people did. What are the options? What should we be doing here? Well, first of all, hydrocarbons don't renew themselves. Unless you're willing to wait around a few million years, and I don't expect that kind of longevity. So they're non-renewable, they're easily exhausted, they're rapidly being exhausted, and they should be left in the ground, is the short answer to it, because oil is far too precious to burn. There are goods which we make which require hydrocarbon products as a base for their manufacture, and there may very well be a need to extract some oil for centuries to come. But at the rate of exploitation that we have just now and the rate of depletion that we have just now, there will be no resource in a relatively short period. Sure, when I say relatively short, we're not running out of oil. It's not going to disappear in the next 5 years, as we were told during the last referendum in Scotland. Could be 50 years, could be a bit more. But nonetheless, in terms of human life skills and civilization, that's a very short period. So I think that the Scottish Government does have a choice. I'm not going to personalise it to one individual. I'm wrong to do that. I think the Scottish Government has a choice in here. And if we believe in Scotland that we have to play a part in arresting climate change and hopefully reversing climate change, then the drivers of climate change have to be dealt with, and rapidly. And one of them is the burning of oil. And therefore, Cambo, to my mind, should be stopped. Now, here's the tricky part. We can't stop Cambo because we in Scotland don't have the power, and there's the attack from the Scottish Tories on the Scottish Government saying you've got to stop Cambo. Sorry, you've got to allow Cambo to continue for financial reasons, for economic reasons. It's meaningless because the Scottish Government can have an opinion but doesn't have the power. I go back to what I said earlier on. We don't have the power yet in Scotland to make the dramatic changes needed in society, the way society behaves, the way society consumes, so that we can play our fullest part in arresting climate change. We only do that through the powers of independence. So link these two things together. We want to stop climate change. We need independence to do that. We want to make sure that we have a safer future for the world. So let's stop burning the oil. And if we do remove any at all, at any gradual stage, it's for more benign reasons rather than just polluting the planet.
Well, the just transition is the thing that's required in order to make amends if we do stop relying on offshore industry. There are 110,000 jobs in Scotland reliant on it. They're not going to be replaced overnight. But there is a strong feeling that even if the Westminster Government do decide to delay or stop Cambo, it will be not much more than an empty gesture because, as I've said, there's no evidence that elsewhere in their political agenda they're prepared to put the sort of finance and economic investment into making it easier for people in the United Kingdom, across the United Kingdom, to be able to become net zero. Back to something a bit more local. Of the many things that have not happened in the last 2 years due to the pandemic, one of them is the orange marches, which happen across the west of Scotland. But it's been announced that on September the 18th of this year, 34 orange marches will take place, with the expected 7,500 people to march. There'll be some small marches, but there'll be one or two larger marches which will converge to form a bigger one. There's been a lot of concern over the years about these marches, as there has been about Republican marches. Some people are asking that they all be banned. Others are saying that to do that would be a breach of freedom of speech. Abdul, how long was it before you were in Glasgow that you became aware, if indeed you were, of these orange marches and these orange parades? And do you have an opinion on them?
Well, I have been more than half of my life now in Scotland. Initially, I could see lots of orange marches taking place, or lots of march take place on the street, and I didn't know much about it. I'm still learning. But my opinion to this would be like, we need to be a community of an inclusive community. We need to do things where we support integration of everyone. We need to do things where we bring people together. This is what I do on the daily basis. This is our logo here. You can see Glasgow Afghan United, and we do lots of work of integration, people together, and uh, tackling social isolation, poverty, things like that. But to me, it seems I don't want to hurt anyone at this politics. Like Office Colin has been here for years and years, but I would just have my opinion. If any marches, anything bring division in our society, I would say no to that. I would support everything which brings our people together, brings solidarity, bring friendship to each other, and make us close to each other. I would be up for that and support that.
I think it's true, isn't it, Greg, that we can say that sectarianism in Scotland is one of our great shames, and it is extremely divisive. And while no one would suggest the official reason behind these loyalist marches is to promote sectarianism, and we're not saying that at all, obviously there has been, or some of the marches have been linked to sectarian incidents and violence in the past, not least 2 years ago when a Roman Catholic priest was attacked, and routes have had to be moved. The Grand Master of the Orange Lodge, Jim McCarra, has come out and said that there is no problem with sectarianism around the marches. And then he went on to say, this government has been trying to determine what sectarianism means for years and years and have not come up with it. No one can put a finger on it. Well, just because no one can identify it or define it or stick it to a wall doesn't mean it doesn't happen, does it?
It exists. Let's never kid ourselves on. And if it looks like a bigot, if it walks like a bigot, if it talks like a bigot, it's a bigot. I'll tolerate just about any kind of behaviour as long as it doesn't impact seriously damagingly on other people. I'll tolerate almost any kind of behaviour except for intolerance itself. And I think bigotry is a scourge of so many societies. Maybe come on to that in just a tick. I will say, by the way, to refer to this as the shame of Scotland, it's not fair on geographically the overwhelmingly major parts of Scotland. When I'm back in my student days, I had made many friends from Campbellton, not that far from Glasgow, Clowfries, and they just didn't know what this sectarian thing was because they had no experience of it. Same with Aberdeenshire, the Borders, the Highlands, all over the place. It's a Central Belt thing. It's an import. It's handy for people not to fall for, this is a problem created by Scotland for Scotland. It's a problem that's imposed. It's divide and conquer, and it has existed for millennia. And I'll just use a few examples we mentioned earlier on. We were talking a lot about Afghanistan and the great game that was played there over several centuries. But there's a few other countries that have had a similar experience in Palestine, where there was relatively peaceful land with Jews and Muslims living side by side. And similarly, the Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs and Jains coexisting fine in India. And in Ireland, there was no serious sectarianism, except until in each of those countries, that country got taken over by a foreign power who realised that the divide and conquer technique is the way of keeping the people down, getting them to fight each other rather than fight the occupying force. And there we have it, and it's still there. And people who still go for the sectarian line and support it in Scotland simply, by and large, just don't realise that they are being played by a power a bit greater than them who doesn't have their interests at heart. How can we handle it? It goes back to what I was saying earlier on. It's about education. I grew up in the Monklands, but the first half of my growing up was done in Coatbridge and the second half in Airdrie. I saw a fair bit of sectarianism. I saw it from both sides of that religious divide. And if you say that there's only sectarianism on one side of that divide, I'm sorry, that is actually a form of bigotry to say that. You have to recognise that it exists on both sides, because if you recognise that, that allows you to begin to address the problem and the sources of the problem, and then to begin to educate people away from that problem. So should the marches go ahead, I would rather just see all such marches just die out, because there's no need for them. But people will do it if they think they have a reason for doing it, and if they think that, it's because that's the way they've been brought up and taught and still being persuaded. So it takes us right back to what we were discussing earlier on, that this is an education process largely, because if you just try to bury it, it's just suppressed. And as with misogynism in the last few days, something suppressed can just pop up in a very disastrous way. So let's learn from all of these experiences and deal with it largely through persuasion and education.
Well, let's hope the marches go off without any incidents in September. The Scottish Government last year commissioned a civic mediation company who's based in England, who have a history of dealing with racial discrimination issues in and around Burnley and Bradford. £50,000 that were given to them to attempt to ease tension over these loyalist parades. I had a look at their website yesterday. I couldn't find any reference to this money or any report that's been produced. I haven't been able to find anything from the Scottish Government, so I don't know if this commission has actually done very much. Certainly there was quite a lot of scepticism from people that were likely to be contacted, whether they thought this would do any good. So maybe it is just back to good old-fashioned education. Deal with this with the younger generation. Maybe mediation isn't the way forward. Moving on.
Maggie, can I add a small bit on that? Could I add a small bit? I think that we have to not just hope and educate, but we have to be possibly even more proactive. I was a great fan of what happened in South Africa after the end of apartheid, and also after the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. In each case, the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and sometimes getting people from opposite sides of a bigoted spectrum to get them together. To find ways of trying to understand where each is coming from, to try and find any kind of common path through that. That's a way to do it. And I would like to see in the future us establish a system of that sort, so that we can finally face head-on sectarianism, address it, defeat it.
That's an excellent idea, and that might be exactly the way to handle if it was decided that all marches on either side of the sectarian divide were to finish, that would be the way forward. And people have been asking that for a long time. As I say, I don't know whether this commission, the civil mediation company, if that's part of their remit, we haven't been able to find out. Moving on, there was a report this week that looking at the BBC and the way that it recorded breaches of the ministerial code, that they seem to be very keen to over-report potential breaches of the ministerial code by Scotland's First Minister than they were of any other politician. Looking at BBC website, both in Scotland and national for 2021, and remember, we're not finished 2021 yet, there have been 143 stories that mention the First Minister in terms of potentially breaching the ministerial code. 83 of them specifically mentioned the First Minister out of those 143 stories, even though she's been exonerated in all of them, as opposed to not really covering actual breaches of ministerial code that have happened by other ministers, specifically in Westminster. Abdul, does this surprise you that the BBC, which is often held up outside of this country as an absolute beacon of fairness and equality, does it surprise you that they seem to be willing to make more of potential breaches by the First Minister of Scotland than they do by, say, the Home Secretary or the Prime Minister or the Health Secretary or whoever?
It doesn't surprise me, actually, because there are several reasons for this. One of them is it is First Minister of Scotland, and coming from SNP, Scottish National Party, who are pro-independent party in Scotland. And then it will come a little bit politics in this one, opposition or supporter, things like that. And as a result, there will be, of course, pressures if, although you haven't committed something, it is clear, and it has been clear by the committee, like everything was clear, like Nicola Sturgeon never did that. So she never she was never committed to that. But yes, because she is First Minister of Scotland, and this is very important rule, and because as BBC, again, I have seen BBC not very friendly with SNP, particularly with our First Minister. And at the same time, like things are, yeah, of course, happening in down south in Westminster, where ministers, as you mentioned, health secretary, even prime minister does lots of things, and they should do the same. They should play the same rule over there, and that is not happening, as you said. Yeah, it is a little bit not a kind of surprising. It's a kind of we're expecting that.
Greg, I don't suppose you're surprised.
Not remotely. When you have a corporation like the BBC, which is effectively a fully owned subsidiary of the government, then that's what you'd expect them to do. Why am I describing them that way? When the chair of the supposedly broadly impartial board is appointed by his Tory chums, and it's it's just a cosy little arrangement of the British establishment to continue a British message, then that's what you'd expect to get. The unsurprising consequence of all this is that over recent decades, the influence and respect of and respect for the BBC has been crumbling. And most people don't go to the BBC for their news. I go to the BBC regularly. I like to think that they're telling the truth by and large on their weather reports. That's about it. And I switched to other channels. Spent a fair bit of time this morning listening to Euronews because I got some genuine international news and objective perspective on world affairs, as opposed to just the BBC punting out its own message. So in the case of the BBC, 143 mentions of a case which wasn't a breach of a ministerial code and certainly wasn't a breach of the law, as opposed to minimal coverage of plenty of cases of alleged corruption not being investigated by the BBC. They used to be very good at investigative journalism, not being investigated by the BBC, and these would be, if true, severe breaches of the law by senior politicians. That's the path that the BBC has chosen. The end of that path is the demise of the BBC in Scotland and the rise of alternative media. Nice to be on Broadcasting Scotland here.
It's interesting, when Priti Patel was found to have breached the ministerial code recently, Andrew Marr asked her if it still mattered, and she basically dismissed it and said, or dismissed its importance, playing it down, suggesting that it might be laid aside during the pandemic, and then finished, quite ironically, telling the BBC it was time it had a good look at itself. That's an opinion that lots of people in Scotland might share. We always like to finish on a positive story, so just very, very quickly. 4 years on since the distribution of the first baby boxes in Scotland, the initiative that was started in Finland in the 1930s, 186,000 baby boxes have been distributed, and a recent survey of how people felt about them, 97% of parents have rated them positively, and in 2020 it was the highest ever uptake. 98% that were offered were taken up. At the time when they were launched, the idea was applauded by Labour politicians. Not Labour politicians in Scotland, Labour politicians across England and in councils in England who thought it was a jolly good idea. Labour up here, however, on the wrong side of history yet again, suggested it was a waste of money. Greg, on any account, this is a positive story. There's no negative spin on this, but how do you think the opposition parties might react to this good news story that baby boxes have been a success and that people like them?
The second best thing that they could do is to be quiet. Because of the nonsense that had been coming away, which was when the boxes were first launched, some were trying to show that these were dangerous, they could catch fire, and they demonstrated that by taking a flamethrower to them. You can melt rocks with a flamethrower. So be quiet is a good start. To actually talk positively about it would be nice. I'm coming from this from a very personal viewpoint. My youngest granddaughter is 1 year old in 4 days' time. Looking forward to getting together, and we'll have a great wee celebration in there. My daughter is awfully chuffed to get the baby box. She thinks it's wonderful. She's proud that our country's doing that. So let's all just celebrate something which 97, now you say 98% of us think is brilliant. So I think that's a majority. So I'll say, yeah, well done, Scotland. Well done, the government.
Well, I'm afraid it's time for us to be quiet now because we've come to the end of the programme. And I'd like to thank you both very much for today. We've covered a lot of ground, and particularly to you, Abdul, for your insight on what's happening in Afghanistan. I come back to what you were saying. Your message and your hope is positive, and I absolutely hope that what you're telling us is going to happen is going to happen. And I hope we can get you back on the programme as things unravel or develop in the next few months to keep an eye on what's happening. And our greatest best wishes to the Afghani community in Scotland, and our prayers are with them for the worry that they must be having for their families and your own family back home in Afghanistan. We end the programme as ever with our usual request for some money. It always takes money to keep Broadcasting Scotland going. We're an independent broadcaster. We don't get any financial support from anyone else. It's down to you. So if you've enjoyed the programme and you want us to see us provide independent journalism in Scotland, please go on to www.broadcastingscotland.scot and make a contribution. Sign up to be a regular donor to us. It will really make a difference. Thank you both again, gentlemen. Everybody have a lovely Sunday, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Abdul.